The Indiana Hoosiers, college football's greatest story of not just the 2024 season, but I would say of the 2020s decade. Yes, one of the worst programs ever in college football in terms of not just being Power 5, Power 4, but overall is 11-1. They're playing at the level of a top 10, top 5 team, dare I say it, in terms of analytics and even the eye test. And they're traveling to the Notre Dame Fighting Irish, who are also 11-1. They have their best season yet under Marcus Freeman, and they are playing and executing at a top 10, top 5 level too, and analytically, they're even number 1 in some categories. According to ESPN's efficiency, Notre Dame is number 1. They're the most efficient team of the 2024 year. The only reason, I will say this here, the only reason I believe that Notre Dame is behind Texas and FPI is because Texas is a 5-star quarterback in Quinn Ewers, and Notre Dame doesn't. I think recruiting rankings are the only thing, specifically at the quarterback position, where ESPN's FPI states nakedly, we treat a 5-star QB like he's special. They care about recruiting a lot on FPI. If not for that, I think Notre Dame would be power rated number 1 in FPI right now. And it's despite the fact that they lost in one of the most humiliating ways I've seen a team lose to NIU this year. But outside of that game, they have won, and in many cases, they have dominated and game-controlled their opponents to death. The Fighting Irish are favored by 7.5 points. This game's taking place in South Bend. It is the Friday night game. 3 out of the 4 first-round games are being played a week from today, Saturday at the time of this live show, on the 21st of December at noon, 4 p.m., and 8 p.m. Eastern Time. This game is being played Friday, December 20th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. In-state matchup between two schools who recently have not gotten this far. Notre Dame at times has, but they've always failed at the biggest stage. They have not won a New Year's Six bowl game since the 90s. I would count this because it's a college football playoff game. It's a big game. They're playing a top 10 team in Indiana. Indiana has not appeared in anything like this ever since, the 60s, 70s, maybe 80s. They have not been anywhere near the mountaintop of not just their conference, but the nation this century. And this is an opportunity for them, and also an opportunity for Notre Dame. So, as I have said, I think this is the best matchup of the college football playoff in the first round. I think this is the most fascinating, and sneak peek, I do think this is going to be a close game, a competitive game. Let's start off with some key matchups here for the Irish and the Hoosiers. It's Indiana's passing offense. I know it lists every position here, but I'm going off of this in passing offense with quarterback, wide receiver, and then tight end, and also running back, O-line, and tight end when appropriate as the pass blockers against Notre Dame's defensive front. How does that work out? What does the dance of the trenches look like, and who does it favor? Especially in pass rush for Notre Dame and pass protection for Indiana. Because it can go one of, technically there's more than two ways, but there's two sides to the spectrum. So we'll just say one of two ways. It can lean toward the side of Jim Knowles is sending more guys than you can block, and Curtis Rourke just falls down. You can't do anything through the passing game. It can be Indiana versus Ohio State redo in favor of Notre Dame. And at that point, Notre Dame probably wins unless Indiana's defense puts together a phenomenal effort, or Notre Dame's offense looks like poverty, like in the NIU game. Or it can go the way of how Indiana versus Michigan went in the first half, or how Indiana versus Nebraska went, where you go up against a great and awesome defensive line, good defensive front, and you either work them or you do just enough in protection to where your weapons can make something happen. That is a spectrum here that will determine the outcome of this game, for sure. Because Indiana's offense has been ridiculously efficient, impressive through the air. And then you look at just what they have done overall this year is impressive. But you look at their offense, they're scoring 40.3 points per game, which is second. And if you count the FCS game, they're scoring 43.3, I believe, at points per game. Their average scoring margin is plus 24.5. They're first in yards per point, averaging 10.3. Notre Dame's second, by the way, in that category, averaging 10.6 yards per single point. Indiana is second in points per play, averaging 0.598 points per play. Notre Dame is first, averaging 0.622. These teams, analytically, are some of the best teams in the country. Now, as I mentioned in my very early preview, they have not played very tough strength of schedules. I imagine if they played, let's say, Georgia's schedule, they would not be as analytically impressive. But still, these are some of the best teams in college football. They are. And Indiana, because that's what we're talking about offensively, has done a great job of not punting and of scoring touchdowns, of getting into the red zone. Right now, they are averaging 5.3 red zone scoring attempts per game, which is first, and 5.1 red zone scores per game, which is first. They have a red zone scoring percentage of 96.55%, which is first. And in terms of total offense, they're averaging 414.9 yards per game, which is 41st. They're averaging 6.2 yards per play, which is 26th. They're averaging 4.2 yards per carry on the ground, 9.2 yards per pass attempt, which is 4th, an average team pass rating of a 171.5, which is 2nd. And in terms of protecting the quarterback, they allow a 5.56 quarterback sack percentage, which is 53rd. But a lot of those sacks came from OSU, and it's not like this offensive line is bad, as we'll talk about. In fact, it's a highly graded offensive line. I just don't think they have any explosive running backs, and Curtis Rourke does not have extreme mobility. So that doesn't help him in terms of escaping opposing pass rushes. But this is interesting. This matchup is here. Because you look at Notre Dame's defensive front, and they're very impressive in defending the pass. I mean, Notre Dame's defense here, they only allow 13.6 opponent points per game, which is 3rd. 0.2 points per play, which is 3rd. They only give up 4.4 opponent yards per play, which is 5th. Indiana's 3rd there, only giving up 4.1. They have a sack percentage of 8.09%, which is 25th. They only allow 5.6 opponent yards per pass attempt, which is 2nd, but also 11.4 yards per completion, which is 44th. That's because they don't let opponents complete passes on them. They're first in opponent completion percentage, only allowing 48.68% of their opponents percent of their opponents' passes, rather, to be completed. But then there's also some weakness there. Some vulnerability. They allow opponents to average 3.7 yards per carry. I think some of that's due to playing service academies and a Georgia Tech, to be frank. So there's probably a negative bias there. But both of these units, Indiana's passing offense, Notre Dame's pass rush, and defensive front, they're great. They're near elite, and maybe relative to this year, they're elite. But they're not generational. There's no Jalen Carter on Notre Dame's defensive line. There's no let's say Amarius Mims or Olu Oluwatimi on Indiana's offensive line, though Mike Katic at center has been very impressive. This is the matchup that fascinates me the most, ultimately. And then there's also Indiana's defense, but specifically their rushing defense, trying to stop a Notre Dame rushing offense that is prolific. If there's any part of a college football team that might be generational, it might be, or maybe not generational, but at least elite, not relative to this year, but just elite in general. It could be Notre Dame's rushing offense. They are averaging 6.3 yards per carry, that's 2nd, and 224.8 rushing yards per game, which is 11th. And they only average 35.7 attempts per game. They don't run that many plays. Notre Dame only runs 64.1 plays per game, which is 116. But what I will say, the best teams don't run that many plays because they don't have to. They get up on you big, they make explosives, they're efficient, and they don't punt a whole lot. They have fewer possessions because they don't need more possessions to score and beat their opponents into submission. Mike Denbrock is running a show over there. He's one of the nation's best offensive coordinators, if not the nation's best offensive coordinator. The same coordinator that last year turned Jaden Daniels into a Heisman winner. The prior year took over an LSU roster that was a mess and made a lot from it. Helped Brian Kelly a lot at LSU. He's back at Notre Dame, and Notre Dame's averaging 6.6 yards per play overall, which is ninth. Their passing offense, pretty poor, but not bad, not terrible. And I think a lot of it is poor just due to the limited talent at wide receiver. The fact that Riley Leonard's always been more of a dynamic quarterback, not strictly a passing quarterback. Notre Dame's offense runs through Jeremiah Love, through Jadarian Price, through this offense where let me tell you the different starters here. Notre Dame offensively, Bo Collins, Jordan Faison, Jaden Greathouse at wide receiver, Anthony Knapp, Sam Pendleton, Pat Coogan, Rago Spindler, and Emil Walker on the offensive line. Mitchell Evans at tight end, who's now thankfully healthy. Quarterback Riley Leonard, and running backs Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price. Against an Indiana defense, they're going to be tasked with stopping Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price. Michael Kamara, CJ West, James Carpenter, Tyrique Tucker, Linnell Carr Jr. on the defensive line, Jalen Walker and Aiden Fisher at linebacker, and D'Angelo Pons, Shawn Asbury II, Amari Farrell, Jameer Johnson, and Terry Jones Jr. in the secondary. They're going to be tasked with stopping a Notre Dame rushing attack that is one of the nation's best. And Notre Dame's rushing offense has not been stopped by anyone this year, but if anyone's equipped to doing it, it is Indiana. Indiana's rushing defense this year is perhaps the nation's best. They're number one in opponent rushing yards per game allowed, only allowing 76.2. Teams don't run in Indiana that much. On average, they only run for 29.1 attempts on Indiana's defense, fifth, because you only average 2.6 yards per carry against Indiana's defense, second, and you only gain about 5.3 rushing first downs per game against that defense too, which is second. Notre Dame in all those categories, by the way, is outside of the top 25. So Indiana's rushing defense is one of the best rushing defenses in the country. It's a better rushing defense than what Notre Dame's rushing offense goes up against in practice, but also they have not played the same rushing offense or anything close to it that Notre Dame has had. Ohio State, when Indiana played them, they were banged up on the O-line, and their offense has been a little bit dysfunctional all season long on the ground. Michigan does not have the rushing offense they did last season or in 2022, although Indiana held them to a season low. And it's the same thing with Michigan State. Not a great rushing offense, but Indiana also held them to a season low. So this is another intriguing matchup. Indiana's rushing defense against a Notre Dame rushing offense that has been really an unstoppable force all year. The unstoppable force against the immovable object. That's what makes this game so fascinating. You look at these offenses, and I got to go with Kurtis Rourke in Indiana at QB over Riley Leonard. Let's recap with these offenses, shall we? I told you about Notre Dame's offense and Indiana's defense, but let me introduce you to the Indiana offense. That being Elijah Sarratt, Miles Cross, and Miles Price, Omar Cooper Jr. and Keshawn Williams at wide receiver, Carter Smith, Tyler Steffens, Mike Katic, Bray Lynch and Trey Wedig on the offensive line, Zach Horton at tight end, Curtis Rourke at quarterback, and Justice Ellison, Tyson Lawton, and Kalen Black at running back. This Indiana offense is very effective at carving you up slowly. They don't get a ton of explosives, but they carve you up, and they do a pretty good job of it too. Very effective on fourth down, very effective on third down. I love Kurtis Rourke as a quarterback. The only bad game he had really was against Ohio State and against Michigan in the second half, and I think that was more on his offensive line and the injury on the offensive line that Indiana sadly sustained from Drew Evans, one of their better guards, their best guard of the season, who went down with a season-ending injury. They have more time to respond to that than they did against Michigan, which was pretty quick, and then also Ohio State. But you got to wonder, how can they respond to that? Can they? I like Notre Dame better at running back. I think that's pretty obvious. Indiana's running back room is very good. It's filled with a lot of power backs. Justice Ellison is the one with the most explosivity, but even he is not necessarily a home run hitting back. Notre Dame has power and explosivity, especially in Jeremiah Love, but Jadarian Price is pretty good too. And I like Notre Dame's guards. They're healthier, and also they're better overall than Indiana's. Where I find a push is tight end and center. Mitchell Evans is back, but also Indiana's Zach Horton is pretty good at tight end, and he's been healthier for the year. And Mike Katic is a dude. He's an absolute unit, an X-factor player for Indiana at center. So is Pat Coogan for Notre Dame, though. So I'm curious to see how these offensive lines do. That's really the position that I'm looking at for both of these teams, because this is going to be one of the better defensive fronts that Indiana's played all year, similar to Ohio State's and Michigan's. I don't think it's as good as those, but Indiana struggled mightily against those defensive fronts, and I imagine that since Notre Dame is a better secondary than Michigan, for example, that they are going to be able to cause some similar havoc. And then for Notre Dame as well, this is probably the best defensive line by a mile that they've played all season long. Best rushing defense. So how do they attack that? How does Mike Denbrock attack this Indiana defensive front is going to be fascinating to me. I don't think either of these teams are just going to be able to punish the other and work the other. Maybe you'll look at the box score after this game and say, maybe Notre Dame really worked Indiana in the trenches, or maybe it's, Indiana working Notre Dame. But I think when watching this game, it's going to be a pretty back and forth affair. On defense, I like Indiana up front over Notre Dame. I do. And I think at DB, it's closer than a lot of people think, because Indiana, they've played Ohio State through the air. And Ohio State through the air is better than anyone that Notre Dame has played all season long. At least they have that. And then Washington is a team that through the air has been good at times throughout the season. Notre Dame, though, on the D line and at linebacker, if you want to make an argument they're better than Indiana, I can't exactly fight against that, because both of these teams have played some softer schedules, and they've played a lot of different schedules. Notre Dame's played service academies. They've played Georgia Tech. They've played teams that love to run the football, in part because maybe their quarterbacks can't throw, or because they're just very good at running the football. It's the same thing with USC. USC is one of the better teams at running the ball. So Notre Dame's played a ton of good rushing offenses, or at least a lot of teams that like running the football and kind of force it down your throat, even if it's not productive to them. Indiana hasn't played that same schedule, but they've also played a schedule that is typically filled with a more consistent, higher caliber of athlete. Like, the service academies are limited athletically, limited in the passing attack. Ohio State is not. So there's going to be a learning experience here for both of these teams. I think they'll have to learn and adjust on the fly. For Notre Dame, defensively, R.J. Oben, Howard Cross III, Riley Mills, and Joshua Burnham on the D-line. Jack Kaiser and Drake Boehm and Jalen Sneed at linebacker. And then Christian Gray, Xavier Watts, Adam Schuler, Leonard Moore, and Jordan Clark at the DB position. Those are some players to pay attention to. We already, looked over Indiana's defense, talking about Notre Dame's here really quickly. I think Indiana's better up front, D-line and linebacker. DB is a push. If I had to lean one way, it would be toward Notre Dame, because they have a future NFL guy in Xavier Watts, who's obviously future NFL. But Notre Dame also suffered an injury there to Benjamin Morrison, which was pretty big. If he was healthy, no question Notre Dame would be better at DB, but he was a pretty big loss, and Indiana has guys like D'Angelo Pons and Shawn Asbury, who are also great players. Other important things to take note of, I think line of scrimmage is a push. It's a wash. I think we'll discover who is better at the line of scrimmage while watching this game. I think Notre Dame is a better O-line, slightly. Indiana has a better D-line, slightly. Notre Dame's slightly better at tight end, which is often, used in blocking. Notre Dame's deeper everywhere than Indiana is from a talent standpoint. That doesn't mean the roster is better, though. And to circle back to trenches, I think Indiana's D-line has a bigger edge over Notre Dame's D-line than Notre Dame's O-line has over Indiana's O-line. Special teams is also a push. Both of these special teams units have some upside, but are also very questionable. I think both of these rosters are pretty close together. Notre Dame, roster-wise, in terms of depth and also how these teams have played, is probably a little bit better on the interior than Indiana is, but Indiana's better, way better at wide receiver and better at quarterback. And Indiana has some depth, too. I mean, that D-line, you got C.J. West, James Carpenter, Tyrique Tucker. You have 3-4 deep at D tackle for Indiana, one of the most important positions in Big Ten football nationally, especially when it comes to two teams like these, where Notre Dame loves to run the ball. And Indiana does too. They're not as good as Notre Dame is at it, but they love to run the ball, keep opponents honest on defense. I think that you look at what the power ratings say here. Notre Dame's favored by 9.6 points per FPI to win, but they're actually a little bit of the outlier there because S&P Plus thinks that Notre Dame will win but by 5.4 points, and my potential power index is Notre Dame winning by 2.5. And standard home field advantage at minimum is really 3 points, unless you're playing in, like, let's say Duke Stadium or Maryland's. And Notre Dame is a big stadium, good fan base, it's going to be loud. Even factoring that in, Notre Dame's projected to win by about a field goal or maybe a bit less, and that's because my power ratings right now actually has Indiana straight up as a better team on the neutral field than Notre Dame. This is why home field advantage is important, and maybe my power ratings are wrong. I mean, S&P Plus and FPI are high on Notre Dame, higher than I am, especially FPI, who has them as the number 2 team in the country and first in efficiency. Efficiency is just strictly, from my understanding of FPI, efficiency is just what you've done this year, not factoring in anything else. FPI factors in more than just efficiency. It's also priors, it's talent level, and I think that's why Texas is better than Notre Dame in FPIs, because last season especially, and also in terms of recruiting, they're better than Notre Dame. But Notre Dame has looked very impressive this season, and then you add in home field advantage. Home field advantage is so important, especially in college, but in the pros, it's professional as well. It's huge that Notre Dame gets this game at home instead of, let's say, Indiana getting this game at home, because that swing right there, 6 points, maybe you could say 7, that's a lot in a college football game that I think is going to be a close, competitive affair. Indiana has a points per play margin of 0.346, which is insane. That means for every one of their plays compared to every one of their opponent's plays, they score 0.346 more points. Compare that to Notre Dame's, though, 0.422 points per play margin, and you kind of get blown away. Notre Dame's points per play margin is insane. It's number 1 in the nation. It's the only team with a points per play margin above 0.4 this late in the year. It's comparable to Michigan's last year, to Michigan's in 2022, and to Georgia's in 2021. It is this time in the season. And their expected points added margin, 0.229. Indiana's is 0.211. Expected points added measures a lot of field position, like how are you expected to score given where you are on the field. Notre Dame and IU both do a good job of moving the ball well down the field, preventing their opponents from moving the ball well, but also scoring touchdowns. Not just scoring, but scoring touchdowns and preventing their opponents from scoring touchdowns or forcing turnovers or stops on 4th down. Indiana's played the 67th toughest strength of schedule. Notre Dame has played the 59th toughest strength of schedule. So both outside the top 50 there. They're both top 10, though, in game control and efficiency. Indiana's 7th in game control. Notre Dame's 4th. Indiana's also 7th in efficiency. Notre Dame, as I've said multiple times, because it's a highlight statement, but it's true. Indiana is 7th, and Notre Dame is 1st. They're number 1 in efficiency per ESPN. When I look at coaching, which I think is going to be important in a game like this, Marcus Freeman has done a better job this year than last, and a better job last year than his first one. But I cannot get that NIU game out of my head. And there's also the fact that Notre Dame, in terms of recruiting, is more talented than everyone they've played this year, sans Texas A&M. And Texas A&M's recruiting rankings are very overblown because Jimbo Fisher did not develop anyone while he was there. He didn't. Notre Dame's been the most talented team, and it's going to remain the case here. If they beat Indiana, the streak will end when they play Georgia, but they might have the better roster than Georgia. I don't know. Georgia's banged up. People have hated on that statement from me. But Georgia's roster may not be the best roster in the country because they're getting eaten alive by injuries. They are, and you can't next man up yourself over and over and over again. It's impossible. Eventually, those injuries, especially when you don't have aliens at multiple positions, and Georgia doesn't this year, unlike prior years, it's going to catch up to you. Just is. So The Irish have a huge edge. And Indiana has too, because they did well recruiting through the portal. Their roster, I think, is better than the blue chip ratio advertises, for example. But what Indiana has done, coaching circles around basically every staff except for the OSU staff. And I think Indiana's players made a lot of mistakes uncharacteristic to them. And I think that Indiana's going to learn from a game like that. The fact that both of these teams, more importantly, are 11-1 with similar schedules. Notre Dame hasn't played anyone close to OSU all year, and they also lost to NIU. Indiana's played OSU. They lost to them. It was a bad loss, but they've beaten everyone else, even teams with better talent. I do think Cignetti right now is a better head coach than Marcus Freeman. I also think that Indiana has a better defensive staff. They do not have the same talent that Notre Dame does, and yet they're putting out similar results. Notre Dame's better at scoring defense, which is the most important. But you look at the total defense categories, IU rules there. And they're much better at stopping the run, which in a big game like this is very, very important. Where I run into some conflict is strength and conditioning. I think Notre Dame is one of the best strength and conditioning staffs in the country, and the offensive staff. I think that Indiana's offensive staff has been one of the best in the country this year, but Notre Dame is Mike Denbrock. They also have one of the best offensive staffs in the country too. So little areas of conflict. Ultimately, though, I'm going to pick Indiana to upset here. I don't think Notre Dame is the same type of team that OSU is, even with the limitations OSU has. Notre Dame's much better at running the ball than OSU is. Their defense is not the same, though. Their passing offense is not the same. And they're a team that is, they have some limitations. They're one of the nation's best teams. They're explosive. They'll beat a lot of teams in college football. But what I will tell you is this. Think about Michigan versus TCU in 2022, where the team with a superior roster, an elite rushing offense that no one had stopped all year outside of maybe a half, and a great defense, met up against a team that was well coached, that was senior laden, that was explosive, that had time to prepare, that had a veteran quarterback, and that had players on offense and defense just good enough to make some plays, some impact plays, like a pick six. I'm not saying Indiana's going to do that. In fact, I don't think they will, because I don't think that Riley Leonard is going to be as mistake prone as J.J. McCarthy was that year. But Indiana's no TCU. They're better analytically than TCU is. Just straight up better analytically. And they've played a tough guy in OSU, and we can still say that. And I think that Notre Dame has limitations. I think that IU is going to slow down that rushing attack just enough to make Notre Dame want to throw it more. And I think that's going to be exposed by an IU defense that is among one of the nation's best. Notre Dame will be able to score on Indiana because I think their rushing offense is that good. Mike Denbrock will have something schemed up. This Notre Dame offense right now is better than OSU's. It is, because the line of scrimmage is that important. But Notre Dame's defense is a fascinating tale. It is, because they're good at stopping the pass, but what great passing offense have they faced all season long? Outside of maybe Louisville, who's, I'd just say, good, and it's the same thing with USC. They have not played a team like Indiana. I think that IU, with a better coach, will take better advantage of this time off, and I think that IU is more diverse and balanced than Notre Dame is. And in a big game like this with a coaching edge, that matters. My model has Notre Dame winning by 2.5 points. The line is Notre Dame minus 7.5. I'm picking Indiana not just to cover, but I'm picking them to win by a score of 37-31. I think weird things are going to happen in South Bend. Could be lower scoring, probably won't be higher scoring than this, but you never know. It's going to be a weird game, a back and forth game, and I think Indiana comes out on top. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also hit that notification bell so that way you can get notified when new content from College Football with Sam drops. I appreciate you very much, and also share the video around to others who you know enjoy the sport of college football and love it as I do and as you do, and comment your thoughts down below so that we can have a conversation, because I want to know what you are thinking. And join our Discord server where we talk college football 24/7 via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. Thank you to my Heisman Patreon members, Crash2488, Brasco Rascal, and Kylo OH. Thank you to my All-American Patreon members, Chris Lane, Ismar, and Tyler Nye. And thank you to my All-Conference members, John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, Joshua Jorgensen, and Will Loftus. Make sure to check out my merchandise store and or Patreon page or super chat down in the comment section below to support the channel. The Patreon page and merchandise store links are in the description or down below in the pinned comment. I hope you have a wonderful day. It is December, so Merry Christmas and also Happy New Year. I will see you guys soon.